Hey, this is Aaron from Cantina Creative. Today in this tutorial, we'll be going over how to use Adobe After Effects for feature film compositing. Let's go. Here's a before and after of what we'll be making in this tutorial. Let's go back in time to set up our example scenario. We've been approved to start work on a VFX shot for a feature film. We've had a call with the VFX supervisor who has relayed important information about the shot and the collaborative vision of the director and the production team. Here's an example of what we could have been looking at on that call. It is an editorial reference clip, which is our first look at how the shot plays out, with temp graphics and rough set extension work already done quickly by the editorial team. This reference will be used for lots of things. It will be used first to help with bidding, so that we know the total length of the shot and the amount of work needed to complete it. It will be used for testing our color pipeline. It will also be used for timing of any animated elements, or even to double check the sync of multiple VFX plates, in our case, the Newscaster element that we'll be adding. Here's what was discussed on that call. The shot needs extension work. Unfortunately, it was filmed without a green screen, and the director would like to have a window to the outside world behind the actor to really open up the scene. We need to replace the graphics. The on-set playback graphics are no longer being used, and we need to add several 3D objects, some CG astronaut figures, and a few CG books to fix some continuity errors with other shots in the scene. The director would also like to see something in the foreground, like a plant in the lower screen right, to help hide the busy area of the frame and add more depth to the scene. They've also requested that the shot feel a bit more atmospheric and moody without any specifics on how they want to do it. With all that info, let's take it away. To conquer this shot, we'll need to 3D track the plate, selectively roto certain regions, then start layering in the set extension element, screen graphics, newscaster footage, and 3D renders of the astronauts and books before we can add some finishing touches to bring the shot to life. We'll be speeding right through some of the topics like roto, knowing that there's already a plethora of tutorials out there. I've intentionally made this tutorial using almost all effects that come pre-installed with Adobe After Effects. However, I do use Video Copilot's FX console, which is a free plugin, to speed up the application of effects. The only other third-party plugin used is for degraining the plate, and that's called Neat Video Reduce Noise. Let's begin. Before we get creative, let's first change a couple project settings. For this tutorial, we will be compositing in Linear Aces CG color. We'll switch to OCIO color management and use the latest configuration file. Let's make sure that the working color space is set to Scene Linear Aces CG. Note that the default display color space is set to sRGB. Once we're in our comp, the display color space adjustment will help us easily view our Linear Aces CG work on our sRGB monitor and can easily be toggled on and off. Once we set up our show's specific color using adjustment layers in the comp, we'll be able to set the display correction to none and view our comp with the final show color instead. This will include shot-specific creative color from a CDL and also the official LUT for the show. For this tutorial, we will be working at 24 frames per second, so it might be a good idea to change your After Effects preferences to interpret footage at 24 frames per second when imported. Let's go ahead and import the media for the tutorial. Don't forget to import all of the passes of the CG element. We'll make sure that we interpret footage with each element, specifying the color space that each footage or graphic is in. After Effects will automatically convert the media from that color space into Linear Aces CG, which is our working color space for this tutorial. It's important to find out from the production team or whoever generated the plates or elements what color space they're in. In our scenario, the plates from production are all in Aces 2065, and the CG and graphics elements are already in Aces CG. I'm going to quickly create a folder structure that I like to use to keep everything organized while I work. After making a new pre-comp using our master plate, we can double check that our comp frame numbers are matching the frame numbering of the plate. In the next step, we'll quickly create an adjustment layer that applies the official show color using a shot-specific CDL and a show LUT provided by production. We'll import the QuickTime reference clip sent to us by editorial, and we can use that to make sure that the color we're applying matches perfectly. For this step, we'll need to set the display color correction to none. The color will be controlled using our own adjustment layer. We will be applying several OCIO effects to complete the conversion from ACES CG into the final show color. First, we have a conversion from our working space of ACES CG to ACES 2065, the same color space the plate came in. Second, we'll do a conversion from ACES 2065 into a log format that was specified by production. In our case, ARRI log C4. From this color space, we'll be able to then safely apply the shot CDL, which was provided by production and has some creative color baked into it. And then finally, the show LUT itself, which converts the log-looking image into a final colored work of art. With the show LUT turned on, it's easier to see what the CDL is doing. And now if we toggle on and off the edit reference that we brought in to compare, if we did it right, the color should look the same. Let's 3D track the shot. For the sake of time, we're going to speed through this process. Our shot has a nice steady camera move and a lot of detail in the scene. It should work pretty well using After Effects' built-in camera tracker. Starting with the denoise plate, let's make a fresh pre-comp and name it pre-track. I've found that the camera tracker plugin works best if you convert the footage from linear ACES CG to sRGB first. This will only apply if you're working in linear ACES CG like we are. Once we've done that color adjustment, we'll pre-comp it again to make sure that the camera tracker effect will acknowledge it. We'll plop the camera tracker effect on there and let it simmer. We can increase the size of the markers if they're too small to see. Now we can go through and hunt down erroneous trackers. You can click and drag around multiple markers at once and hit delete on the keyboard to get rid of them. It's a red flag if you see some markers that are uncharacteristically giant. Especially watch out for markers that are on moving objects. It doesn't take very many wacky markers to really mess up your track. Under the Advanced tab, we can see the average error as a rough gauge on how good our track is. The lower the better. And it looks like we're actually at a good spot already. As we clean up the markers, you'll see the number update. Once we're happy, let's set the origin to a nice spot in the center of the scene, close to all the areas we'll be working with. Note that I'm selecting as many markers as I can that are on a flat surface in the scene. This will help give us a good ground plane and origin. Once the ground plane is set, we'll create some nulls and the camera. Let's place a solid where the ground plane is. Now I'll create a couple more solids to help with the placement of the monitors. Again, just using the markers that we want that are on the correct plane. I'm going to throw a checkerboard on each of these solids. They're super handy for reviewing the track. At some point during this, I like to jump into the top view and just double check that the solids that we're placing are lining up nicely with all those nulls in 3D space. When we play back our track, we want to make sure there's no jittery motion or small bumps. Now I'm going through one last time to grab any markers that I think might have a position in 3D space that'll be useful when we're compositing other elements. Be cautious with generating too many nulls in your scene. It can quickly bog down the user interface. You might only need nulls in a few key locations. If you find yourself in a scenario where you're having to scale the nulls by 10,000% to see them, then you might need to scale the entire scene to be more workable. You can do this by creating a 3D null, parenting all of the 3D objects in the scene, including your camera, to the null, and then scaling that null. If you delete that null, you will then see the new scale values on all the objects. It may take some playing around to find the best scene scale. Note that once you've altered the overall scene scale, it will make it difficult to generate new nulls again from your original camera tracker. I like to use CC PowerPin to corner pin the checkerboard onto the monitors. It's handy to have its viewport guides and also its expansion controls. Once that's done, we'll make sure that the corners stay put throughout the entire shot. I like to put a keyframe at the start and one at the end just to be safe and make any small tweaks if needed. We'll do the same for the right monitor, and then view our handiwork, carefully checking that the track is locked on throughout the entire frame range. Roto is another topic that we'll be breezing right through, as there's already tons of tutorials dedicated to the process. In a nutshell, I'll be using Mocha to assist with rotoing specific areas in the scene that will be overlapping with our screens and set extension. Mocha will have an easier time tracking smaller pieces. I try to create regions that all move together so that we aren't trying to combat constantly morphing and changing shape. While working, be sure to disable the gear icon for layers that you're done with. Otherwise, Mocha will continue to try calculating them, slowing down your system, and potentially altering some of your masks. There's all the pieces we need for now. Back in After Effects, you can choose to view or apply the matte right in the Mocha effect, but I've found that using masks is faster. Select Create AE Masks to generate them. I like to paste them onto a solid, making sure that the resolution of the solid is matching the resolution of the layer that we rotoed. For some additional roto, we can use our 3D camera and 3D nulls to help us out. I'll copy some of those from my 3D track comp. After finding a 3D null that is in the right location, we can copy its position data onto a fresh solid and then add a mask to the solid. In this case, we are using it to help roto the window frame and wall. We'll do the same thing for the edge of the monitor here. We'll also go find some 3D nulls for the wire basket, and we'll put a solid in that location as well. Once we have all the bits of roto that we think we'll need, a nice way to work with it is to add some red, green, and blue fills to the different parts of the roto. By separating them out like this into different color channels, we can make it easier to use for various mattes while we're comping the shot. It took me a second to figure out the best colors to use for each element, but in the end, I made the region for the exterior set extension green, while the matte for the monitors and CG elements will be able to utilize the red channel. Okay, we're back here in the main work. We've got our 3D track all set up. We've got our roto all ready, and let's bring in some elements. All right, so we can take a look at a couple of these things. And this is going to be the guy that we're going to comp into the exterior for the set extension. And it is just a really quickly generated from Adobe Firefly. We've got kind of a basic kind of city skyline. Bunch of little spaceships have been added, which are moving and they have little lights and blinking. And this will kind of add some motion and some life into the background, which is going to be super out of focus. Yeah, let's start with the exterior. Drag it down into our main work for now. I'm going to go ahead and pre-comp it immediately. Call this exterior plate. I'm actually going to pre-comp it immediately again, and we'll call it exterior work. And this will kind of help keep things organized. I'm going to take a copy of plate denoise, bring it in here as well. This is where we're actually going to comp the exterior. Well, I actually need the roto work as well. Copy that one. So this exterior plate, just to get an idea of what's going on here, I could shrink this, move it around. Now let's utilize the roto that we did earlier to get it in the right spot. If we take a look at this roto work, we've got a red, green, and a blue channel on it. We're going to use the green channel, in this case, to isolate the area that we need this to be seen in the exterior. Well, there's a lot of different ways we could do this. What I'm going to do right now is actually utilize a shift channels, and we're going to set all of the take red from, green from, and blue from. I'm going to set them all to green, and then we'll only be looking at the green channel here. And we can actually use this now as a luma matte. So I can take this exterior plate, drag the track matte onto the roto work, switch it over to a luminance matte, and immediately It's getting stenciled out in the correct region. So right now it's just sitting perfectly still, unrelated to our 3D track. So we do need to make sure we get it in the right position. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and head over to where the camera is in our monitors comp. I'm going to just grab the base nulls, 3D camera, copy those, go to our exterior work. I'm going to paste those in. I'm going to take a look at the top view. You might be kind of hard to see this. So you can see where the camera is. You can see where at least all of our desk stuff is and all kind of the close proximity items. And what I want is this city skyline should be way out there. What I'm going to do is take that exterior plate, make it a 3D layer, and I'm going to start pushing it back in Z space. I'm going to switch back to top. Yeah, just kind of see where I am based on where the other things that it did track in the room were. Yeah, we'll want it to be pretty far away. Now I'm gonna have to scale it up a bunch to kind of counteract that until we kind of get it back to where we want it here. That's looking pretty good. We can always come back and mess with the position later. While we're in here, I'm gonna go ahead and put these nulls at the bottom so it's easier to see what we're doing here. Okay, head back to the main work where we've got our show color toggled on. There's a couple ways you could do this. We could turn the plate denoise off here so that basically this exterior work has an alpha and is completely isolated from the rest. We can comp it like this and then have the plate sitting underneath it like this. But we could also just leave this turned on, and this is kind of our new base plate where kind of the exterior work is being done first, and then we'll start layering other items on top. Either way is perfectly fine. It's kind of a personal preference. Now that we're looking at our roto with other items in the comp, it's easier to see the edges and what they need, which is blur. So different edges might need different amounts of blur depending on the focus of the camera and where we are. We're going to need to work on that right now. So I'm going to go ahead and go back into my exterior work. You want to boost the exposure a little bit, and I'll just lock this comp for a second. And I'm going to head into the roto work and open this up as a little side element here. And let's go ahead and zoom in on different parts of our image. Let's go ahead and look at his face, for instance. One thing I could do immediately is add a little bit of blur to the entire roto work. I'll do it inside here. I'm just going to do an adjustment layer at the tip top of our entire roto work where we give all of them a little bit of blur. That immediately helps all of our roto because there is an inherent softness to the entire plate. So we want to make sure we match that as closely as possible. So we're going to start with a base amount of blur on everything. Then from there, we'll focus on other objects and make sure we have enough. Like this back wall, for instance. It's the farthest away from camera. It's probably going to need the most blur. Here we go, the wall edge roto. I'm going to go ahead and add feather to its mask. I might even take that mask, pull its expansion in a little bit, just to make sure that we aren't getting some bright edges from the old plate. Same thing with this monitor. Mask expansion, just pull it in just a hair. The frame for the window, that's going to need quite a bit more blur. The roto around the actor should probably be pulled in just a little bit. Start bringing the expansion in on those. Even just 1 pixel goes a long way. Overall, it's looking much better. We can always come back and finesse this a little bit more, but let's just go with this for now. So I'm going to go back to the exterior work where I was comping this in. And before I forget, let's change its blending mode. It'll look a lot better on add. Now that I'm looking at this here, I think I'm going to tweak the position a little bit here. Maybe even make it a little bit bigger. I'm looking for some nice cinematic framing here. The right balance of buildings. Something like that looks great. So we're going to go ahead and add some blur to this. Camera lens blur. Built into After Effects here. Start cranking it up a bit. Now to get some nice bokehs here, I'm going to go ahead and make it round. We're going to make these slightly anamorphic. We are going to add a little diffraction fringe. And we'll probably dial in the values a bit more later. Let's just go with something like that for now. All the little lights on all the ships really pick up, giving us nice little bokehs that are going to follow them as they go. Let's go see how this is looking back in the main work with the color on it. It's looking pretty cool, like that. Make sure it extends to the top of the frame and we're not seeing any black edges. I think that looks pretty good. Looks like we've got it just right here, so it doesn't expose any edges at the top. I feel like if you go any higher, you start to get kind of a weird perspective. It looks like you're looking down at the city instead of kind of out level with it. All right, I'm happy with that. Let's RAM preview it and check it out. Next step, let's comp some graphics. All right, let's comp some more stuff. Let's add the monitors now. So in our graphics, we've got our graphics that we already imported. Let's go ahead and turn on our 3D tracked monitors, which are just checkerboards at the moment. So I'll go into the left one, bring in the graphics, turn off the checkerboard just in case I want to look at it again later. Let's go up one, down into the right, plop the graphics in there, go back up to our 3D tracked monitors again. Now we've got the monitors sitting in the correct spot. Go back up to the main work. We'll get the depth of field in there accurately. Looks like our focal plane is focused kind of the front edge of this one on the right. And it kind of goes out of focus as you get to the far left. One thing that I'm hyper aware of is aliasing. That can happen when you have a really sharp object, especially along thin lines. You'll see some aliasing issues. To fix that, we're going to sling a little bit of blur onto it prior to the corner pin. It's like a little bit of pre-blur. Make sure I hold control so it does it very subtly. And do the same thing on the screen, right? All right. And that kind of takes the edge off. Once I've done that, now we can add the camera blur. I am going to apply it as an adjustment layer so that it kind of spreads across both monitors in an accurate way. We'll call this depth of field. Again, I'll just put a camera lens blur on this. This time we're going to utilize a blur map though. So I'm going to go ahead and just make it to do a quick blur map. I'm going to create a solid. I'm just going to immediately pre-comp that. We'll call it depth map. And I'm just going to throw a gradient ramp on that. And our focal plane is somewhere here. Go check out my handiwork here. I can just kind of turn this on low opacity to kind of see what's happening. This kind of makes it a quick and easy way. I can just do an adjustment here. The black is where it'll be in focus. So I think somewhere around there. And we'll have it be going out of focus to the far end of the monitors. So it gives us this range, which will give us a lot of control here when we're adding our custom depth. That layer does not need to be turned on. We're just going to source it from this effect. So from the camera lens blur effect here, right now, because it's on adjustment layer, you'll see that it's affecting the entire plate. What I'm actually going to do to fix that for right now, I'm going to take this plate, put it on top of the comp on like an add blending mode and lock it real quick so I can see what's going on. Definitely a lot less here. For the blur map, I'm going to go ahead and select that depth map we just made. And immediately you can see that the graphics on the right are in focus and they are getting further and further out of focus as it goes to the left, which is exactly what we want. I'll go ahead and do the same things I did to the other effect where I made roundness 100, aspect ratio, slightly anamorphic, little diffraction fringe. And I'm going to keep lowering this until we match the plate precisely. Beneath the graphics, you can even see the graphics of the screen below it. So it's actually a really helpful reference. It might even be just a hair more blurred. All right. I'm just going to go back up to the main work to check it out. I can actually see a tiny bit of the old graphics coming through, so I'm going to fix that here in a second. This one on the right, I feel like is still too sharp. So let's go ahead and go into here. I'm going to do a fast blur, this time on the other side of the power pin. There we go. So again, that helped with the anti-aliasing issues. Still feels kind of weirdly sharp at the top. Ah, that's the old graphic bleeding through. One thing I'm actually going to do here, we have full control over these screens, and I think these are supposed to look more sci-fi anyway. Right now they look a little bit older. So what we should actually do is thin up the bezels on the edge anyway. The quickest way to do that would be to go into here, and in our CC power pin, we've got our quick and easy expansion properties. So we can just go ahead and start expanding these out a little bit. I'm gonna see what happens if I expand this. Oops, I need to make sure to turn off repeat edge pixels on this fast blur here, because what that ended up doing was cropping it down to where the original boundary box was. Let's do something kind of like that. So I'll do 4 on top. I should probably do the same on the bottom. Maybe a little bit on the right and a little bit on the left to match it. All right, that'll be cooler. Already looks more modern. We'll do the same on the left. For this one, the 4 is looking too much on the bottom. Let's go with 3. That's better. And that will immediately fix some of those edge issues we were seeing anyway. There we go. This line does not look straight on the bottom edge here. I'm gonna fix that. I'm gonna fix that by just lifting that corner a little bit in the bottom left. So I'm gonna go bottom left, select it, make sure it gets both, hold control and lift up. There we go, that's better. The line looks straighter down here. And if I compare the graphic against the plate that's around it, it's all sitting in there with the right amount of blur and defocus. Excellent. One thing I actually, while zooming in on these monitors here, I can already tell that they're too dark. It's always kind of, it's always a red flag when you see the black values going darker than the darkest shadows of your plate even. That's an immediate red flag that compositing is not working at the moment. So to fix that quickly, we just need to do like a very subtle lift on the blacks. Gonna pull them up. And if I'm zooming in on a dark area here, sorry, make it easier to see. As soon as you start adjusting that value, you'll see it start to lift. And I haven't gone very far at all. If you aren't used to working in linear in After Effects, the values would be so different. To do the same visual effect, you might actually take this black level and go up to like here if you were working in sRGB or X709. If I turn on and off this levels, you can actually see that it's actually doing a lot. If I turn off my exposure adjustment, toggle it on and off now, you can see that it actually is helping a lot. Let me go back to that 0, 1, 8. It's lifting it up. It actually already feels a lot more natural than it did without it. While we're here, let's go ahead and bring back some of the roto. Let's go ahead and bring the lamp back on top here. All right, let's do it as a little patch here. So put the roto back to 100. So I'm going to take a copy of our plate denoise, duplicate that. Let's use the red channel this time from our roto work. I'm going to go ahead and put a shift channels on it. Change these all to red. Track matte that with Luma instead of alpha. Oops, turn it on. There we go. And immediately our lamp just popped right back on top. It's also pulling him, which in this case we might not want. We've already done that work in the exterior work. It could negatively impact some of those edges we've already dialed in. So what I'm going to do here is create a quick garbage matte that just uses the roto we need to bring the lamp and mug back on top of the monitors. So it's just going to select this area. So it's just bringing back the plate over the graphics in this area. Another way of doing this, which would work just as well, I could delete this. We could actually just have our monitors themselves. This layer can track matte the roto work with that layer. Again, switch to Luma. I'm going to have to invert it this time, and that's going to do the same function. If we solo the monitors and I turn on alpha, you can see how it's using that roto matte to cut away the pieces that it needs to cut away from the graphics. So that works well. All right, graphics are looking good. All right, let's go ahead and add some CG, starting with the astronauts. We're in the main work here. I've turned off the other stuff we're working on. I've already brought in the passes that we're going to use. We have the main beauty render, which includes all the passes baked in. We have a diffuse lighting pass. We have a puzzle matte that we can use to matte out different areas. We've got reflections. We've got shadows, and we've got specular. All right, so we're going to use all these passes, kind of put them all together to make our astronauts. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make a solid, immediately pre-comp that, and we'll call this CG astronauts. All right, and we're just going to go ahead and let's just bring all of them in here, and we will kind of work on reordering these a bit. At the very bottom, we'll have the main CG, and we'll use that as a reference throughout, but we're actually going to kind of rebuild it with the passes, individual passes, instead of using the final one. So I'm going to have the diffuse be near the bottom. I'm going to turn off the puzzle mat. Then above the diffuse, we'll have specular and reflections. Both of those are going to want to be on a different blending mode. I'm going to put those on additive blending mode. Okay, so we've got those in there, and I'm going to turn off shadows for now too. And there is our guys. And that should look something similar to, if I took a screenshot of the base beauty pass, it should look similar to comping these like that. And if I switch between them, you can see that yes, it is very similar. We're going to comp this in this way. Gives us a little bit more control so that we can control the reflections and the specular kind of independently if we need to dial them in a bit better. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my reference one at the bottom. I don't need the solid back there either. Let's make this puzzle mat more usable. I'm going to divide this into 3 channels actually to help us isolate the areas we need. So first I'm going to rename it Mat Astronaut, and we'll put a shift channels on that. And we're going to grab just the green channel. So I want to take red from green, take blue from green. Basically all of them are going to pull from green, which will allow us just to have a nice black and white mat. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this for the other things as well. So mat for the desk, switch them all to red. Let's do it one more time, and a mat for the books. We aren't going to be focusing on the books at the moment, but I'm just going to have it here anyway. All right, so we've divided that one out. So the puzzle mat's very usable with 3 different mats. I'm just going to go ahead and put these at the bottom, and we can source those with track matting later. All right, so we do need to make a nice alpha for these astronauts. First thing I'm going to do, before I select the mat for the astronaut for all of these, I'm actually going to go ahead and pre-comp these with this blending happening already. And we'll call this Astro CG base. All right, so in there, we've just got these simple process that's adding specular and reflections. I'm gonna go back up to CG astronauts, and now let's track mat to the astronaut. I want to switch it over to Luma, and now we have a beautiful alpha mat for them, looking great. Now we gotta worry about the shadows. So to add the shadows, what we could do, we're actually gonna use these, I'll put these near the bottom. They're gonna be used as a mat. There's a lot of different ways, again, that you can do this, but what I'm gonna do this time is this black solid. I'm gonna have that black solid source the shadows. So there we go, it's only applying the shadows. What I'm gonna do here, just because they were all rendered together, I'm just gonna do a quick matte here, kind of a garbage mask around the area I want it to be. I'm just gonna check the end frame. Let's do 1 keyframe here. All right, and I'll add a little bit of feather just in case. All right, so now we've got our shadow and everything in here. We'll kind of just throw this back into the main work. But before I do that, notice that these shadows are also adding shadows onto the astronauts. I actually want to not include their area for that. So what I can do is do a set mat. This allows us to do multiple track mats. This one's sourcing a layer like that. I can do the same thing by sourcing a layer using the effect, and I will pull the astronaut one. I'll need to switch this over to luminance, not alpha, and I might need to invert it so that it's only applying. Most importantly, I also need to make sure that I'm including effects and masks. There we go. Because there's an effect on Mat Astronaut, which is where it's pulling the green. So it's important that when I use the set mat that I have it sourcing effects and masks. And that removes the shadows from their bodies. So now we have shadows just underneath them on the ground. All right, let's see how that looks in the comp. Let's go back up to the main work. I'm now gonna turn on the base plate. I'll turn on the color, leave off the matte bars for now. Looking pretty cool there. They do need a lot of work still. They're very sharp, so we're definitely gonna need to add some blur. Let's go ahead and add a camera lens blur like we've been using for other ones. Turn the roundness up. Sometimes what I like to do is not just the camera lens blur. I like to first add a tiny bit of softening before we're even dealing with the blur happening from the camera's focus. I'm just comparing it to the areas around them to kind of get an idea of how the focal plane is in that region. It's subtle. Then there's some additional color correction and stuff we should do here as well. Looks like their shadows are getting a little bit too intense. I feel like they should not be darker than every other shadow in the plate. So we're gonna wanna lift those a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead and put a levels on there. I'm gonna put it before the blurs. Maybe I'll try lifting a tiny bit of blue into the shadows. And then I'm gonna switch back to RGB and we're gonna lift a tiny bit of black overall. Start to lift those up until they hit just the right spot. I'm kind of looking for that nice, even, as I lift the exposure here, it should feel very natural with the way that their shadows go up compared to everywhere in the plate. Maybe I actually just want to pull these shadows down just a hair to like 80% opacity. the end of the day, it is a lot of back and forth, getting this just right. It's also a lot of guess and checking it from far away, checking it close up, checking all the different exposure levels. And you kind of constantly, it's almost like when you're driving, you're checking all your mirrors and always aware of what's going on. You're doing the same thing while you're comping. All right, we're gonna call it good there. That's looking pretty good. I think we'll leave them like that for now. We can always come back later once everything's kind of coming together and we can see how they're holding up. I might just add a tiny bit more blur in the shadows. I feel like it's bugging me a little bit here. Let's give it a whirl. Nice. Yeah, that helps. You don't really see any edges coming from that. I'll go ahead and put these in the pre-comps they belong in. All right, there's one more thing I want to do here. Down all the way in the CG base. Yeah, it's mostly in the diffuse here. I feel like the paint that's on them is almost neon bright. Actually, before I even do this, let me take a screenshot. See where we were. Let's see if we can get this a little better here. Yeah, that kind of takes a bit of that intensity away, which is kind of helpful, but I don't want to mess with any of the reflections. I feel like I want to keep all those. Let's go back to the main work. Ah, much better. Might not even need that hue sat anymore, honestly. Just by darkening them, that's helping them sit in there a lot better. All right, let's go with that. Let's go ahead and add the other CG, which is the book that'll go into this basket here in the foreground. All we'll do for this is just duplicate the astronaut CG pre-comp and adjust the matte channels so that the book is being matted correctly. The next thing we need to do is definitely bring back the basket here. We also need to blur these books accurately. Books are a lot more foreground, so they're going to need to go more out of focus. So similar to what we did with the astronauts, let's go ahead and add a very subtle fast blur first. I'm going to also add a camera lens blur, same values we've been using. I'm going to take a look at the books right around it, see if we have enough. Actually, it looks really good. It's somewhere right around there. It might actually be even a hair more. Let's work on getting the wireframe in front of it. So if I go into my roto work, we've got our wireframe here. All right, let's see what happens if I took these CG books and matted them to that roto mat. Same roto mat that we used for the monitors over here. It's got a lot of these bits and pieces in it. So I'm using that same mat with a track mat. You'll immediately see that while it worked, it does not look great, just due to the nature of what's happening with the bright object that was behind the wire mesh in the original plate. Kind of bleeds around, especially in the defocused areas. So it kind of creates this not very accurate look now that we have a darker object that's supposed to be behind it. So we're not going to be able to use the roto like we normally would. What I'm going to do instead, let's go into my roto work, and I'm actually going to use this to bring back some fake kind of wire in the foreground. So I'm going to actually turn it off in here because we don't need it as a roto anymore. I'm going to go ahead and copy this layer, paste it in the main work. Oh, immediately we have an issue. It's a 3D layer and there's no camera in here, so it's not working at all. I'm gonna need to also copy the camera. There we go. Now the layer is here. All right, so what I'm gonna do with this layer, I'm gonna change its fill so that instead of it being red, we're gonna just turn it black for a second. I'm going to feather these masks a lot because now we're essentially painting in some fake wire mesh in front of the books here. Even with that small amount of work, it's already working better. Now, what I want to do actually, I might try to pull a value to make sure I have the right color. It's not just black. It might have some other kind of tones in there. So I'm actually going to use the eyedropper. With my basket roto selected, the layer with its fill, I'm going to do an eyedrop, hold Control so that it uses a larger sample size, and grab some dark part of this basket here. And my goal, there we go, is to just make sure I have the right color for this solid. I'm gonna go ahead and unsolo everything. Right now, this solid is going farther than it needs to. It's actually going beyond where the books are. And theoretically, I only need this to exist right where the books are. So I'm just going to tell this to track mat the CG books themselves. There we go. Now, if I turn that on and off, you'll see that it's only impacting the area directly where the books are. So it's helping bring back that frame without adjusting parts of the plate that we don't need to adjust that are outside of the work area. One thing I'm noticing is that this wireframe has a little bit of a specular highlight on the top. So if I want to be fancy, we probably want to bring that back as well. All right, we're going to do it with layer styles. And I'm just going to quickly give it a little bit of bevel and emboss. As soon as you pop that on there, immediately it gives you a crazy result, but we can just dial that in. Interesting. Layer styles ignore track matting. Not in love with that. Okay, in that case, we're going to create, I'm just going to go ahead and pre-comp this then, and we'll call this our basket frame. We'll call it paint. If I solo that, there it is, okay. So I'm actually going to go ahead and go into here, do the layer style down in here. Oops. I don't want CG books here. My goal here is to do the layer style in here, then do the matting up one more comp. Let's go ahead and do another bevel and emboss. What I'm actually going to do, let me go up to the main work. I'm going to do the trick I did before. I'm going to lock that viewer, but also create another little viewer over here so I can see, while I'm working, I can see what it's doing. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust some of these bevel and emboss settings. Let's see, inner versus outer. I think I want, actually inner is interesting. I like inner. Adjust the angle. Yeah, just so it's catching kind of the top edge of all of those. Perfect. Size, let's make it much less. And adjust the depth, less there too. Really want to make it subtle. Maybe a little softening. Bring the opacity down. I think that's about all we need. Something like that. Actually, a little bit more opacity. Shadow, I actually don't want it doing any shadow, so I'm going to go ahead and turn shadow off. We just want to keep the value that we've got going on there. I think I'm kind of happy with that. It still feels like it's going too far, but 5%. No, it doesn't want to go any less far. I think it has to do with how much I feathered it. If we don't feather this quite as much, yeah, that definitely impacts the bevel and emboss quite a bit. Maybe we don't want to do the feathering here. Maybe we want to do the feathering up a comp. That way we can get the bevel and emboss just right in here. That should work. So back up in the main work here. Now I can go ahead and do the track mat that I was doing before with the CG books. Make sure the CG books are still on. There we go. Definitely I'm going to want to now add blur. Let's just actually go ahead and add the same values we added to the books. Let's go ahead and add those to the frame. Maybe this is actually an indication that this is too much. Let's go ahead and go with 4 camo blur and then 4 on the books. I think the books might have gone too far. I'm not going to do camera lens blur for the mesh. I'm just going to do a regular blur. Camera lens blur was kind of, because of the optical effect it's doing, it's expanding the highlight too far. The highlight's getting just too out of control. So even this bevel and emboss, let's go ahead and bring that down, maybe even more. Got a bit carried away there. All right, that's much better. Looks really natural in there now. So we've just got this fake just with a solid and a small bevel and emboss. We've kind of recreated the frame to go in front of it. Fits in really well. That's going to look great in the final shot. The books themselves still need a little bit of work. You'll see that they look good toward the top end, probably a little bright still, but the bottom end, we haven't figured out the shadow yet. So let's go ahead and get that in. So I'm going to go dive back into the books here. All right, what's going on with our shadow? All right, I'm going to go ahead and make a new mask. We're just going to do a quick mask just around the base of the books. And I'm going to do a keyframe at the start and a keyframe at the end. Perfect. All right, that immediately helped quite a bit, honestly. I think we can actually go in and tell our shadow in this case to be a little bit darker. There we go. I'd say the books are a little bit distracting right now. Overall, I think they're a little bit too bright. Maybe we'll just go in and, similar to before, we're going to just adjust. Oh, actually, let's see. A lot of this is actually coming from the specular. So I'm just going to darken that specular a bit. Let's see how that's going. That helped a lot, actually. Yeah, those are looking great. Right now, you can probably barely see it, but there is currently still no grain in the whole area where we have our CG, and there's no grain on our astronauts either. That's kind of the final polish. We're going to make sure that everything has that grain perfectly added back on. And that's really going to do that last little 5% to help it sit in there perfectly. That's looking pretty great. It's got these nice little highlight pings. Looks like it's being lit from the set. The astronauts being lit from the lamp. Perfect. Let's move right on to the last CG element we'll be adding. For For this one, we will utilize Adobe's built-in Advanced 3D. Let's go ahead and bring in our model of a plant that we're going to put in the foreground. I'm going to go ahead and import that. Snake plant geometry here. It's a GLTF file. You can see a little thumbnail showing us what the plant looks like. It's a super simple plant. No work has been done texturing it. It's kind of ready to accept kind of some lights in the scene. And we also know that it's going to be comped really dark. It's going to be in the foreground. It's going to be out of focus. But what's nice about using a 3D object for this, as opposed to a still frame, is that we'll get some nice parallax, hopefully, as the camera kind of moves past it. And you'll actually see the 3D quality of the plant in all the leaves. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start off a new comp by making a solid and pre-comping it immediately. We'll call it CG plant work. All right, we're going to hop in there. We're going to bring our plant in here. First thing it's going to do is maybe warn you if the render engine wasn't set up in your comp settings. It's telling you that it's switching over to advanced 3D. I'm gonna go ahead and just leave all these default for now and hit OK. You can't see it yet. It's probably way too small in this scene, but we'll fix this in a second. So let's go ahead and bring in the camera and nulls that we've been using for everything else. This time around, I'm gonna grab all of the track nulls, all 100 and such. I'm gonna grab those and the camera together. I'm gonna copy those, go to our CG plant work, and I'm just gonna go ahead and paste them in here. I'm gonna go switch to top view. This is gonna be the most useful here for figuring out where we wanna put this plant. Let's go ahead and I'm just gonna hit this little shy guy and hide away a lot of the nulls that we'd hidden before. So our snake plant, by default, he is way over here. First, let's see what's going on with the scale. I'm just gonna scale him up. I have to hold shift. Maybe I'll move the camera a little bit so we can see what we're doing. But yeah, I'm gonna wanna put him somewhere between the camera and the desk. Might err on the side of closer to the camera, might give us some nicer parallax as we move past it. Checking the first and last frame to see how much movement the camera is doing. Let's try somewhere in that vicinity for now. Maybe lift him up a bit. Just kind of scale it to taste here. At the end of the day, you're never going to see the whole plant. You're just going to kind of catch a bit of it as you move by. So already you can see that he's 3D tracking with the scene, which is great. We've got the position in relatively the right location, somewhere between the camera and the desk. At this point, we can play around a little bit with the rotation, maybe find something that looks good. You just want something that has some nice little shapes of the leaves. Okay. Now what we can do here to make this really start to sing, because at the moment he looks very flat. So we should bring in an environment light. Oh, this should be organized. Put that in models, put that in pre-comps. All right, I'm gonna show you really quickly how to generate an HDRI that we can use to light the scene based on the actual plate. So I'm gonna go ahead and hop into our version of the denoise plate. We're gonna use this to help us generate the HDRI. It's gonna work great because it already has quite a bit of latitude. And if I bring the exposure up and down, you can see that the lights in the scene, they have a pretty bright exposure. If I mouse over them, you can see in the upper right info panel that these are up really hot, up in the 5s, 6s. That brightness is gonna come through in the HDRI really well to help light our object. So you actually really want those big bright areas. So I'm gonna go ahead and take this pre-comp and duplicate it. We'll name it HDRI. Just gonna delete out the other stuff. One thing I'm gonna do first is make this wider so that it'll wrap around the sphere a little bit better so that we can rotate it into place. We don't need a huge resolution for this. I'm gonna cut the 2160 in half. Let's fit this to height. All right, so I'm just gonna leave this in the middle here for a second. And I'm going to do a quick paint/stitching thing here that's going to fill that out to the edges, which will help us wrap around this whole, we're kind of pretending this is an environment that's all the way around the camera, so that when we put our 3D object in, it'll get light kind of from the whole room. We use a reptile set on unfold. We can expand out left and right. All right, so that does a quick, kind of fixes the points at the edge there. It kind of starts to repeat back. Maybe I will do a solid based on some kind of dark wall color that's in the shot. Turn it down for a second, and maybe I will remove the duplication of our actor here, remove these extra computers over here. We're kind of making up the rest of the room essentially, just for lighting purposes. You'll never see it beyond that. All right, so we've got that. That's looking good. There's a quick way we can kind of make sure that the edges don't have a seam on the far left and far right of the screen. We want it to be able to tile. We can quickly and easily do that just by doing an adjustment layer. We can put a transform on that and tell it to scale width, basically flop it. And if I just put a little mask on one of the sides, it's only showing that transform over there. What you're seeing on the far right is actually flopping over to the far left now, which is gonna help with our seam. I can just feather this out. I actually like the idea that there's maybe another light that's coming in that's somewhere kind of off screen. All right, we're ready to make our HDR. So once you're happy with this, we're only gonna be rendering out a single frame. We'll save frame as file. We're gonna go ahead and go into our output module settings. We can leave this as preserve RGB or ACES CG. We're going to go into our format and we're gonna do a radiant sequence. And that will create the .hdr file that we need. I'm gonna quickly output this. Looks like I've already got a couple in there. I'm just gonna increment this up, make a new one. All right, render that out. Now we can just pull that right back in and we've got our .hdr file. I'm going to interpret it. ACES CG, that's what we know it's in. All right, so we've got that. I'm gonna go ahead and put that into elements, images to keep organized. All right, now I'm gonna drag it into our plant CG work. All right, I can turn it off for the moment. And we're gonna go ahead and make an environment light now. Make a new light, environment light. I'm gonna leave all the defaults for now, hit okay. And down in the light options, we can now change the source. I'm gonna go change the source to that layer that we just brought in. And as soon as I did that, you'll notice that the plant got a lot darker. It's now pulling the lights from that environment. We can also adjust its intensity here if we wanna change how much it's affecting the plant. Now, one thing we can also do if we wanna position this correctly, you can adjust the rotation of the light. And as you adjust, say, the Y rotation, you're essentially kind of spinning it around in the environment to kind of line up how you want the light to hit our CG. But you can't really see what's going on. One thing that kind of helps with that, we've got a simple plain model of a chrome ball that was just kicked out as a GLTF straight out of C4D with default everything, just pure reflective and metallic. I'm gonna switch to top view. I'm just gonna stick it right in front of the camera. It's somewhere easy to see if I keep it near the plant. And maybe I'll scale it up even more. And you can see immediately that it is reflecting the environment light that we have in our scene. So as I adjust my Y rotation on this, you can see it reflecting our HDRI. So if I want to position this accurately to what's going on in the scene and get the lighting right, it would be somewhere kind of in this range where you can see that the part that is being reflected most is behind us, and that's kind of the area we've stitched. And then it's catching bits of the actor and the lights and stuff that are on the other side of the plant. For this scenario, you could kind of do it to taste. One thing I'm kind of looking for is like nice little specular highlights on the edges of the leaves. Maybe it'll catch little brighter areas. So it's kind of at this point, for this specific thing, this can be to taste. I actually really like the way that's catching the edges there. That looks nice. So we're gonna go with that. I can go ahead and just turn off this chrome ball. It's just used for reference here. Let's go ahead and RAM preview this. See how our plant's looking. Awesome. You can get some great bit of parallax here. If you watch along the leaves as the camera moves, there is some really nice natural parallax happening among the leaves, which you wouldn't get from anything but a CG object. And what's great about this is because it's all right here in After Effects, I can change its position on the fly, we can rotate it, we can change the lighting, we can do all that, and you can see it's rendering really quickly. So let's go ahead and see how that's looking in the main work. Cool. All right, so he's obviously way too bright. I'm just gonna go ahead and turn down the light. Let's actually see what it looks like if I just put it at 100. I'm gonna do a little bit of color correction just right here. Maybe we'll adjust the gamma a little bit. We wanna bring them down till it's at a point that's kind of in line with some of the darkest shadows in our shot here in the actual plate. That looks good. Obviously we'll need a bit of blur. I'm gonna toss the camera lens blur. We'll do the same settings we've been using for some other ones. And we'll crank this pretty high probably. Ooh yeah, love the way that the bokeh accentuates the highlights and the speck hits there. Looks great. Honestly, the plant color is looking pretty good as is. I do wanna make sure he's not erring too far on the bluish side of green, but it looks pretty in line with what's going on with the other plant. I also wanna make sure it's not just too saturated overall. There we go. And might go even darker. Really want to feel like it's silhouetted here in the foreground where we're just catching those pings of light. What we can do if we want these highlights to really shine, we can actually just play with this a bit more. Kind of a balancing act of pulling the gamma down a bit while also crunching the brights. There we go. It's looking pretty good. He's probably a little bit too far into the frame here. I'm just gonna scoot it a little bit to the right. There we go. Not blocking quite as much now. Let's check out a RAM preview of just the plant on its own. If we increase the exposure and speed it up, you can really see the parallax that we're gaining from having a 3D object live in the scene. Cool, I'm happy with that. If the plant was any more visible in the final shot, we'd probably want to spend some time texturing the model. All right, so here we are. We've added some stuff to our scene. We've got our exterior added in. We've got some graphics in the monitors. We've got some CG astronauts, and we have some CG books also in the foreground. And we've brought back the basket kind of on top. And now there's still a gaping hole here on the left monitor where we need to add our newscaster. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure I brought in the elements that I'm gonna need. We've got, with the graphics, we have a graphics 3, which is a pre-rendered element that somebody else has designed already. We're going to also bring in a plate that came from production. Let me bring in both of those and see which one it is. Yeah, perfect. It's element 1 here is the newscaster with his green screen. Let's make sure that they're in the right color spaces. So being interpreted correctly. Came in as ACES 2065. That is actually correct for this one. Production has told us that that is the color space that this footage is in. For the CG graphic, that one, we know that it's actually supposed to be ACES CG, as specified by the vendor doing it. Okay, make sure that's interpreted correctly. I'm gonna double click and take a look at it. So you can see here we have some alpha baked in. We have a simple lower thirds and a little news bug that says live. That'll go in the corner. It's kind of empty there where we can put whatever text we want for this shot. So the first thing I'm going to do is hop down into our monitors. Let's go into the left screen. Actually, first I'm going to organize them a little better. Elements, graphics, make sure the graphics live there. We'll make sure this plate goes with plates. Oh, looks like I already brought it in. Awesome. I'll get rid of one. Okay, I'm going to bring both of those down into this comp. I'm actually just going to go ahead and immediately pre-comp these. And we'll call it Newscaster work. We're going to kind of treat it as a self-contained element that will do all the work in there, kind of create it as a piece that would then go into the video player, almost like it's its own shot. All right, I'm going to go in there. I'm just going to change the composition resolution to a simple HD, 1920 by 1080. I know that that resolution is going to be plenty for this scenario. There, you can see even at 100% scale, a 1920 by 1080 is going to sit like this in our graphics. And he's going to end up being a bit smaller anyway. And I can see right now, I'm just kind of taking a look to see how he'll fit. And it looks like this is going to be pretty great. All right, I'm going to go back down into the work. We need to key him. We're going to then also add kind of a simple newscaster background. Makes him feel like he's in a studio or something. And then of course we'll add some text and some fake news stuff. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is key him. You'll notice that if I was to fit his plate to the to this comp, you'll see that he's got his massive studio bathtub almost. He's sitting in there. We have liberty to control this plate and rescale it to make it fit in the scene. If we were to take this and look at how this is going up here in the main work, you'd see that he is tiny, very small. So we're going to instead pretend that it's a much closer camera angle on the newscaster. I'm actually going to go to his plate here and I'm going to scale him up. And we'll go with pretty large, kind of find a nice framing so you get a little bit of his desk. Let's try something like that. I forgot one thing here. It's always a good idea to do a pre-comp of each kind of asset or plate by itself. So if I go in there, I've got a newscaster plate with nothing on it. I'm not gonna have any effects here. And this makes it really easy if we need to do later any like little paint work or different things to this. We can also swap in the new plate really easily. We don't have to worry about it being used in multiple instances throughout the comp. So there will be only one location that these EXRs are sitting like this. I'm gonna go back up. And now here, I will do the key light. So I'm gonna go ahead, throw the key light. And this should be a pretty simple key. I'm gonna go ahead and do the eyedropper. I like to use control to grab a little bit larger sample size. Okay, if I turn on alpha, that's actually looking pretty great. Took a little bit out of his desk, but that is not very worrying. The main thing I'm worrying about here is that none of the key is coming through him or his skin. And it looks like we're in pretty good shape. But I'm gonna go ahead and fix this table here. So to do that, I'm gonna go really quickly into the screen mat. I'm gonna clip white, start pulling that to the left. As I do that, the desk is getting fixed. There we go, didn't take much. Just bringing it down to about 90. It seems to do the trick. There's a little bit, you can see his desk here, where the reflection of the green screen was happening. That's totally getting keyed out. So what we can do to fix that, I'm gonna go ahead and turn that off for a second. I'm actually just gonna do a really quick roto mask and just, well, I'll just bring back on top all of this stuff down here that I know has nothing to do with the green screen. So what I'm gonna do is this, and then I'm actually just gonna de-spill the green down here. So a lot of different ways you can do de-spilling. There's a bunch of different effects. They all work and do similar things. I'm just gonna do an advanced spill suppressor for this one. And I'm just gonna leave it on, standard this time. I'll double check his hands, make sure they're not being affected too much. I'm gonna go ahead and unsolo that. All right, so now if I turn that on and off, you can see we're bringing back the table. It's nice and gray. Not in love with this black bar either here. I'm just gonna remove it really quick because we're gonna replace this background anyway. So I'm just gonna go ahead and subtract out. And this is the layer that has the key light on it. I'm gonna go ahead and subtract out that, feather that just a hair. Okay, and we'll just add back where this blue bar is. I'm not worrying about getting too perfect with that. I don't think it'll be seen at the end. At least it's much better than having that black bar. Okay, now we're just going to need to do a background for him and some text. So for the background, I'm gonna go ahead and just start with like a solid. We'll do desatty blue kind of thing. Put that on the bottom, name it background. I might actually put a fill on it. I'm just gonna eyedrop the original thing. Now I can come in here. We can change it more easily with a fill. Now let's do some cool looking little kind of motion graphic-y backgrounds that have slow moving elements. Let's go ahead and do something like that. So I'm gonna make another blue solid. We'll make it a little brighter, more saturated. Let's just scale it up, add some stripes, varying widths. Take those, let's make them kind of slashy here. Kind of cool. Let's try adding a little drop shadow. Ooh, there we go. There's a cool effect that gives it a cool shiny look. What is it called? Light sweep. Aha, I think CC, yeah, that's it. CC light sweep. This is really cool. You can just kind of really easily guide these little shiny little spots. Maybe I'll add another one, put it over here. Kind of adds these nice little dimensionality to them. Makes them feel almost like they're CG. I'm gonna wanna add some animation to this. Let's maybe add, just do a keyframe at the front, keyframe at the back, and we'll just kind of like have them shift over a bit. Let's just go ahead and see if that's a comfortable amount of speed. We don't want it to be too distracting. Let's just do a little less. There we go. Looking pretty cool. Maybe we'll play a little bit with the color of these. Have that at the beginning of it before everything else so I can kind of control some different stuff here. They actually look good when they're more desatted. In the background, maybe I actually want that to be darker. Yeah, something kind of like that. It's kind of cool. Ooh, we should add, let's definitely add a little motion to light sweep itself. So if we just add a little keyframe onto the center for these, we can just kind of do the same thing we just did for the other motion. We'll just add a little bit of right. It's very subtle, but these will also be shifting to the right. Once we kind of are happy with one, we can even duplicate them. Maybe we scale it up. We could change the whole thing, bring it to a new area. Kind of weirded out why these blades are not. I dragged them all at the same time. I'm not sure why they're wanting to be a little bit dip. Oh, wow, look at that. It is not moving them the way I thought it would. We're gonna actually, we're just gonna do that instead. And I can just scale, there we go. I think that will solve our issue. All right, so now we've got new blades. Keyframes are all good. Now I can duplicate it, scale them up, adjust the anchor if I want. Whoa. There we go. Add some blades on top of the other blades. And if we really want to make this dynamic, this one that we put in the foreground here, maybe we actually have this one travel a little bit faster. Better yet, the other one a little slower, so it doesn't go as far. Now let's just go ahead and see how this is going. All right, so we've got multiple blades, kind of going different speeds. I'm not in love with how in the middle here, I know what we need to do. In this blade 2, I'm gonna go ahead and just move one of these light sweeps. The way it's covering the other one is bugging me. So if I move it back just right, there we go. Kind of add that separation there. Okay, got our light sweeps. Got our background. Cool, pretty happy with that. Let's go ahead and add a little blur to that. We'll add an adjustment layer. Fast blur will be just fine for this. I'm just gonna add a little bit. I'm actually not gonna go too far. Just enough to set it in there behind him so it's just a hair more than he is. I may even add a little sharpening to him. If I threw an unsharp mask down on his plate, we just add a little bit of sharpening. Yeah, that actually does help quite a bit. Notice how I didn't degrain yet. I'm not even going to. If we wanted to, well, we'll see. Up in the main work, I highly doubt you're gonna see any of this grain, but if we wanted to, it would probably be smart to throw this through a reduce noise. We'd render this out as an element, bring it back in, because we don't want it to slow down our comp a whole bunch. I mean, if we wanted to add a little noise to kind of match what's going on with his noise, we could do that. Quickest way to do that would just be to add one of these little noise layers. These are really fast to calculate. A small value, 6-7%, that is adding back some noise, similar to the noise that he's got. And notice how it's underneath him there. So he's sitting on top. And then this is just applying that noise to all of our background. Guess we'll need that same noise as well for the graphics. If I want, I can duplicate that, track mat it to the graphics. All right, great. Everyone's got noise. Just gonna dial it back just a hair. His table is a little distracting. I'm just gonna do a quick, yeah. I'm just gonna darken down this area kind of. I might even tint it a little bit to that blue that he's got down there with the lights. So it's not as distracting. That big kind of white bar. We'll pretend that his table kind of goes down and it's darker. We'll add our whatever the approved text is that we're going to be talking about here in the news. Real big news coming. Read it all here in the text down here. But I will make sure that these are aligned to each other. Awesome. So let me just go ahead and check that it's all looking good. We can even RAM preview this. While it's RAM previewing, I'm just kind of making sure everything's organized, named. We can easily backtrack what's going on. All right, let's watch it all back. That looks awesome. Very cool. Before I do any color correction or anything to this, I just want to double check how he's looking in the monitor itself as we go up. So I'm just going to go ahead and go up one by one. We'll go up to screen left. Actually, right out of the box, looking pretty good. And take this moment to make sure that he's fitting in the right spot. I like to do this method here. We're just going to create a solid, make the comp size. I'm just going to really quickly draw a mask. I'm going to go ahead and line it up exactly where I want the footage to be. This is a great way to kind of control it. So I can control his size independently from this. But yeah, I'm kind of lining him up right where the graphics are. You can kind of see where he should be. Once I've got that in position, I will immediately use that as a track mat. And now what I might do is take his scale and err on the side of larger, just slightly. There we go. And then let's go ahead and see what he looks like. If I go up again, go back up to the main work, just go to the first frame. And let's just take a look at him in overall context. I don't think we need to make any major changes to him. Looks good to me. The only thing I might be taking a look at here, as far as the monitor treatments go, if the monitors themselves have a sort of a wash to them or a certain color, you might want to make sure that the element you're comping in also has that with it. Notice how even in the darkest shadows of the monitor that we're comping in, it has some greenish blues to it, and he does not. So go back down into here. You can see that even the darkest values in here have sort of a green tone. The whole monitor has like a bit of color. I'm going to throw levels onto him, and we're just going to bring a tiny bit of green into these shadows here. By lifting this one, you can immediately see some green kind of coming into his coat and coming into the dark areas. That looks great. Maybe I'll even try to see if a little blue needs to come in. That kind of brings it into the same world of what we're looking at here. And that's actually just going to help it sit in there just right. So now I'm just kind of taking a look at it in context with fresh eyes. And I think his background is too bright. That immediately is drawing my eye in a way that I don't like. So I'm going to dive back in and we're just going to adjust it real quick. And I'm just going to do it as an adjustment layer underneath the Newscaster plate because I feel like he's looking okay. It's just this background behind him. Quickly added a hue sat and the levels. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring this background. I'm going to gamma down a little bit. So we're going to bring a little bit more saturation and maybe we'll just darken it overall as well. You know what I think it might benefit from? Let's go ahead and just throw a quick vignette back here too. Centers the focus on the Newscaster. We'll just quickly do an adjustment layer real quick with a big feathered oval. Let's go ahead and set that to subtract. We will put a curves. Levels would work fine. Just going to kind of pull down the midtones here. Nothing like a good old vignette. I'm liking that already a lot better. And I know I said I wasn't going to adjust the Newscaster, but I still might. I am going to go ahead and add a little bit of color correction to this layer of him. It's subtle, but I'm just going to lift his gamma up just a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and put that also in this other one. Make sure that the desk gets the same thing. Let's go see back in the main work. Much better, much better. Still might be a bit too bright in the background. There also might just be a hair too much contrast between the blades and the background themselves. Brighten the background just a hair. And then overall, maybe pull those all down with the CC here. This is kind of nice because it actually makes it feel like his, like the set that he's in is kind of matching the same colors of the lights that are going on his desk. It's all pretty cohesive, looking nice. Let's see what it's like if we blur the background even more. I do want to make sure that the background studio element is not more distracting than he is. He should be the distracting one. That's much better. I really should have taken a screenshot, but it's definitely better. And his background is less intense. Awesome, that's looking good. We are ready to move on. All right, let's get on to some more fun stuff. Let's do some atmosphere stuff. That sounds fun. So we'll go ahead and start with maybe the light here. Actually, maybe even before I do that, we should add kind of the overall atmosphere to the shot, which will give us the idea of how foggy it is in there before we go ahead and add the light to the lamp. So I'm gonna go ahead and just make an adjustment layer. Well, we'll call it Atmos. Yeah, that sounds good. And we're gonna do this. I'm gonna try doing it with a glow first. Right out of the box, there's a lot of stuff we should do to this. First thing I'm actually gonna do, I'm gonna bring the threshold way down. Like I want it to impact almost the entire plate. We're gonna bring the radius way up, like way, way up. So obviously the intensity is way too much. Let's go ahead and bring that way down. It's kind of cool, but obviously too much still. As we dial this in, continue to mess a little bit with threshold and radius. So one thing you'll notice immediately is how much brightening is happening overall. It's creatively changing your whole exposure of the plate. It's lifting a lot of the dark areas, and we don't necessarily want to mess with that. What we can do is we can kind of counteract what we've done with the glow. Maybe we add a curves and we kind of start pulling down the mids here. So notice how now we're getting atmosphere, but we're not getting an overall increase in the brightness of the plate. We're counteracting it with this. So we're kind of getting all that nice haze, but we're not actually messing with the exposure overall. Probably still way too much, but it's getting there. We can easily just dial it in here. But notice how the radius has to be giant for this kind of thing, maybe even more. Because you don't want to see, let me lower it down to like 100. If you're just trying to add a little bit of atmosphere, you don't want to visibly see the halos around the bright areas. But if you go with a large enough radius, it will kind of add that overall adjustment. It definitely adds the feeling of atmosphere without necessarily damaging things. When I toggle it on and off, what my goal is, if I blur my eyes a little bit almost, I want to make sure that the overall feeling of the plate and the exposure is not being impacted. It should stay about the same. That's kind of what I'm looking for there. And this combined with the little lamp glow that we're going to add is going to go a long ways. All right, now we can do the lamp. Let's start with something as simple as a solid. I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this plate that I keep as a backup down at the bottom with this gray solid. I'm just going to pre-comp this and we'll call this lamp light work. So now I can go in there and maybe I'll turn this plate into a guide layer. I'm going to make this little pre-comp where we can work on the lamp. We can visually and quickly see how it's looking over the plate. So in order to position it, we need to get a couple things. So let's go ahead and jump into where we know our track is, which is in the monitors. I'm going to go to top view where we can see the nulls really clearly. We know where the desk light is. I think it's this clump of nulls here. So this, I'm going to take that null the camera. I selected both, copy, and I'm just gonna paste them in my lamp work pre-comp that I was making. So got a null. It looks like it was on the back of the lamp there. It looks like it's gonna track in just fine. I'm just gonna copy that position data. First, I gotta turn that solid 3D, paste it on there. I'm just gonna go ahead and scale up this solid a bit. I wanna make sure it covers the area we're gonna be doing the lamp light. I can use anchor point to go up or down to kind of position it in the right area. Maybe I'll also just rotate it so it's facing the camera a little bit more here. I'll start with a quick mask here. I'm gonna start with something kind of like this. Okay, it's gonna look stupid at first, but the magic's gonna come in when I do the fall off on it. So for this, we're gonna use the mask feather tool. And the idea is that in the area right by the light itself, there's not going to be a whole lot of feathering. And then as you get further and further away, there is much larger fall off. Round off this one. I feel like he's messing up our thing here. Oops. So we're going for kind of that really large fall off. Right by the lamp, it's going to feel like it's coming out pretty sharp, dissipate. And we'll also want to do maybe an additional mask here that is going to control the fall off much larger. Give this guy a huge blur. All right, there we go. So if I turn off this plate, that's just a guide layer, we'll see it kind of alone. I'm gonna bring back the roto for the lamp so you won't actually see that. Okay, we're back in the main work. I'm gonna try to put him in the hierarchy where he needs to go. He would be in front of the astronauts. And let's go ahead and, where's our roto at? Here's our roto. The red channel is basically what I'm gonna want. But there's also the coffee mug. So a couple things we could do here. I could take the Mocha Roto layer. I could go right into my lamp light work. I could paste it in here, making sure only to use the lamp pieces. I could just delete the rest. We've got a nice little solid in here of the roto ready to go. I should be naming my layers, my bad. We could simply take that as an alpha matte, invert that. So it's kind of already being pre-matted down in this comp. And then I could go back up to the main work here and you'll see that we've got our light. That's one technique. We can kind of use that to pre-mat it. And I can control this independently from the other rotos, which is kind of nice. I can get this dialed in because maybe I will actually want to adjust this roto a little bit to make sure that this light falls off around the edge really nice. So maybe I want to take this main one here, pull its expansion back a hair, which is going to help it kind of go around the light. I need to adjust my mask already, I can tell. I might even just add more feather at the start coming out of the lamp there. Yeah, that's already immensely better. We could keep finessing this a little bit more, but we're going to actually dial this in way more subtle anyway. Honestly, based on where the bulb probably is in here, I think the cone might be a hair large. So we can just quickly adjust that. Just kind of narrow the cone a little bit. Yeah, that's maybe a little better. Okay, now let's work on the color. We have an indicator here of what color this light is, so let's go ahead and utilize that with a fill. Notice how I'm not going to pick whip the color from right here. If I did that, it actually wouldn't grab the right color because we have an adjustment layer with our show color and everything happening all at the top. So if I want to make sure I select the right color, I actually need to solo where that color is coming from, which is in the original plate here. I can still turn back on my lamp, but now I've got this plate. I can see the color of the yellow coming in there. I'm going to go ahead and grab it now. It's going to pull the value from the actual plate, which might even have a value over 1. It's really highly exposed. Like if I moused over that on the plate, I can see actually in the upper right of my screen in the info panel, we've got our reds and greens are up in the 2.5 range, pretty hot. So, and when you do an eye drop, it pulls all those values. It doesn't just cap it at 1. So once we did that, you'll notice that actually our light immediately got even brighter than it was. I'm going to leave that fill, but I'm actually just going to bring the opacity, start dialing it way back until it feels kind of more natural in the scene here. All right, so we've got our lamp and it's adding a little bit of atmospheric light. It's looking pretty cool. I'm gonna go ahead and just change the color of it so you can see it. I'm digging it. One other little bit fun thing we can add to this is dust. So I'm gonna go ahead and just go into this pre-comp. And what we're gonna do for the dust is start with a solid. I feel like that's how we start with everything. We're just gonna use CC particle systems and it comes with After Effects. It can do a lot of things when you just need something simple, especially dust. Let's get this working. I'm just gonna solo it for a second. I'm also going to take its layer and drag it back a bit. That'll give it some pre-roll. You can kind of see what you're working with a little bit easier, because if you start from nothing, it's a little bit harder to see. All right, so we're going to go ahead and change this to something different, maybe twirly. Velocity should be 0 maybe. We want like no gravity. We want the radius of the producer. We want that to be pretty giant. All right, I can't even see what I'm doing right now. So I'm going to go ahead and switch the particle type over to like a faded sphere. Well, let's just make them really big for now. Maybe our radius is way too big, apparently. Apparently these values go a long way. So let's try that. Birth color, I'm just gonna make them, let's have it go white to black on death. And we can also change the opacity map to be fade in, fade out, so they're very subtle. We want them to live on screen for, I don't know, 3 seconds. Have even less be born. Well, let's just see what's happening first of all here. All right, they're appearing and they're not even moving. So let's go ahead and see if we can add a little bit of something here. Maybe I need to give them a little bit of inherent velocity. All right, also the birth size, I'm gonna actually, because I'm seeing them appear too quickly when they spawn. I'm actually gonna have them start at 0, and then they'll get larger and larger over time, but they're also fading out over time. So that'll hide kind of the end there. Size variation, sure. Depth size, let's actually go smaller. Now I'm actually gonna start to shrink them down into dust size. All right, these are looking pretty cool. Definitely moving way too fast still. Let's try 0.1 velocity. Not bad. Wow, there's a couple of things I don't like. Like there's this one spot I'm looking at here where particles just literally appear in a line from each other. That does not look really real. I'm gonna go ahead and just change the random seed. Hopefully find something that I like a little bit better. They're still way too big. The end size should still be pretty microscopic. It's probably really hard to see. That's why I'm cranking the exposure here, just so we can catch a glimpse of this. But until we put it in the comp, it's actually gonna be pretty hard to see. They look like they're going way too fast. What I might do here is once I kind of get a system looking good, like let's say this was my slow dust at 0.04, I'm going to duplicate the whole system, change the seed, and maybe I'll go ahead and have this new one, have these particles travel faster. And I could do less particles. So it'll only have a couple maybe, but they'll be flying through the screen at a faster rate. And you'll just only occasionally maybe get a glimpse of one of those ones. I'm gonna go ahead and pre-roll these even more. I wanna make sure that the system is fully running by the time we start to see it. Okay, I'm just gonna unsolo those. So now that we're looking at our light, you know, I might actually take these layers. I'm gonna go ahead and put them in the same 3D space. This would barely ever be noticed, but technically they should be in 3D space. So we've got our dust. I'm just taking a look at how many dust specks are kind of hitting the area of light here, to see how many we'll end up seeing in the final product. Because we actually don't want to see all the dust that's outside. We actually only want to see it where the light is. To do that really quick and easy, just add a mask. I might even have it go just beyond, as if it's catching the light. So I could do something like that, and very similar to the mask that's on the other layer. We could feather that a bunch. Let's put the same one on the other one. There we go. So we've only got our dust. If I crank the exposure, you can see that the dust specks are only barely existing where our light is, with a few that kind of go out beyond. It's looking pretty cool. I think I probably feathered these too much. I want to make sure I get the right fall off too. Again, I want the dust that's nearest the light, like right by the source. That should be the brightest, and it should really fall off pretty quickly so you don't see the dust over there much. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract. Okay, put that layer on the, whoa. Put that layer on the other one as well. Don't know why this mask doesn't want to work the way I would expect it to work. I'm gonna go ahead and cut these masks entirely. The danger probably happened from trying to mask the actual layer where the particle system is on. And I have a feeling that something somewhere is not happy with that. So it's much safer if I just create a random solid first. And maybe I just make him 3D, I scale him up, I put the same masks on him, and we take the positional data, put it on there, put the anchor point and all that. I can visually see it now, which is nice. That was kind of the area I wanted. Now I can tell these guys to track mat that. This is going to be safer. All right, this is now working as intended. There they are. We can really dial in this. Now, well, what's nice about this is no masks on the actual particle system. I can adjust in one place. I can get this fall off really dialed in. All right, it's incredibly subtle. Let me turn on the background plate. If I had this in the background, probably should have had this the whole time. We could have been seeing kind of what's happening. Remember, this is just a guide. This isn't how they're going to look in the final thing. It's being colored up a comp in the main work. But we could take a look and see how this is going. And we can see if it's got the right amount. And what I might do is watch this once or twice. I can see if I like in general what's happening. If I'm not happy with where the particles are, I could always just go in here and adjust the seed. And we can get something totally different until I'm kind of happy with where the particles are appearing and whatever. But for now, I'm going to leave it like this. I think this is going to be pretty good. I'm going to go see how it looks in the main work. Okay. We've got our lamp light here. Not seeing, at least on this frame, I'm not seeing any dust. They're there. Okay. We're bringing down the exposure so far here. If we want to even catch a tiny glimpse of these guys, we might just need to go in here and make these more visible. We can either make them, maybe we'll want to make them a hair larger, honestly. So depth size, 0.07, 0.07. I also am going to be wary of how sharp they are, because nothing in the plate is that sharp as that little point is, little speck of dust. So to be safe, probably going to add a very small fast blur to it. Yeah. I also wanted to make sure that they're bright enough. So right now their opacity, max opacity I could put to 100, that'll help. Let me just go to the main work, see if I can see, okay, it's so subtle, but I see a couple. I might leave it like this for now. Better to be on the subtle side for dust than too visible. And I do know they have quite a bit of motion. So I think the smallest, even though they're not very visible in a still frame, that motion is really going to bring them out. All right, so we've got our newscaster now. We've got our lamp light. We've got a little bit of atmosphere. There's a couple other things we can do to make this even more awesome. We are going to add some steam so that it's a little bit more believable in the shot here. To do that, let's go ahead and make a solid. I'm just going to pre-comp it as is, and we'll call it steamy coffee. No, steamy coffee work. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and add CC Particle Systems 2. This comes with After Effects. It's ready to go. It can do some pretty cool stuff when you play with it. Out of the box, it doesn't look quite like a steamy cup of coffee, but we'll get there eventually. First, we got to figure out what system to use. I'm going to switch to Twirly. I played around with a lot of different ones, and I like Twirly a lot. You'll notice that gravity starts with 1. So in this scenario, we don't want gravity to be pulling down our particles. In fact, we want it to be doing the opposite. So we can actually reverse the gravity so that the particles will be rising. They're going way too fast, clearly. So let's just go ahead and shrink the velocity way down. Actually, we can just set the velocity to 0 for a second, and you can just see what gravity alone is doing. Let's generate a lot less particles here for a second. Similar to what we did before, I'm going to take this particle system and back it up. And now you can see kind of midway in the system. First thing I might want to do too is just kind of make this shaped more like a coffee cup. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring the radius out a little bit. Maybe the radius in Y I'll bring to almost to 0 because it's kind of, we're looking kind of sideways at the coffee cup. Okay, cool. So now they're flying up from there. Great, they still look insane. Let's go ahead and lower the position of the producer also. So this will give us a little bit more latitude for comping. Clearly we have way too much gravity still in the negative. So let's shrink this down to something really small. There we go. Let's work on these particles. Right now the particles are tiny. And the cheat for making something kind of foggy or atmospheric with your particles would be to make them a lot larger. Also not lines. Let's go ahead and do like faded spheres. Immediately more foggy. That's great. Birth size, you want to do something pretty small. Depth size, you do want it to get bigger. You'll notice that as you go larger, it immediately gives you the feeling that steam would, as it dissipates into the air, the particles are spreading out. The color's bugging me here, so let's go ahead and fix that. We'll just do like a black and white thing for now. We'll do a birth of white, death of black. I like to do that so that over the life of the particles, they naturally sort of disappear. We're going to be comping this additively anyway. So basically by having it go black, it's going to basically have it fade off. Opacity map will have it fade in and out probably. And that'll kind of hide the generation of the particles at the start. Also kind of help them in their fall off at the end. All right, we've got something that looks slightly steamy. Here's where the transfer mode can come in. Since we have enough particles and they're kind of overlapping each other, we might want to play with screen or add. you'll notice as soon as I adjust the exposure, you can really see the latitude that's happening now as the brightness of each particle is being added to the one below it. I'm definitely going to stick with additive for now. And what's cool about this, we can just bring down our max opacity for the particles overall. Because remembering at the end of the day, we're making an incredibly subtle little bit of steam. I might just boost this just for viewing purposes. It's rising still too fast, probably. Let's just gravity even less. See what happens if I make the particles last longer. What we can also do with this pre-roll is kind of nice. I can just find a spot and start messing with some of these parameters, like the birth rate. If you go too low, you start seeing individual spheres. You go too high, it gets more dense. But you can then take the max opacity and start counteracting that by bringing it down. And what you're actually going to end up doing is getting a more realistic sim here. So now you can kind of see it rising up there. And now you aren't looking at individual particles, which is nice. You're actually just kind of getting this overall vibe of where the densest part of the steam is. We could even bring our max opacity down even further. That looks great. I'm actually super happy with that already. So one thing that's worth playing with, we can throw, let's say you threw like a levels on it. You can go into the alpha for levels and you can start crunching down the gamma of the alpha. And what that might do for you is really accentuate the areas where the particles are overlapping the most. So I've got it about 0.67. You're left with kind of the main moments of steam. And if you think of looking at a steaming cup of anything, you're catching hints in different locations. It's not a uniform steam that's rising up. You're actually just catching little tiny tidbits here and there of points where the moisture is coalescing the most. That's cool. I like that. There's another trick I want to show you too. So maybe we'll keep that, maybe we won't. Just so you can visually see this, I'm going to put a black solid as a guide layer. This will allow me to actually up this exposure so you can actually see it. When you're dealing with something with such low transparency, if you actually leave it with a transparent background, it only goes so far with the slider when you're trying to up the exposure. You can't actually see it. So by just putting this on as a guide layer, it allows me to then control it with this slider so you can easily see what I'm talking about. So if you're happy with what you've got, another thing you can do is duplicate it. And in the new one, you could just shift the seed. And on that one, you add a vector blur. And vector blur is really cool because what you can do with that, if we increase this value to the right, it will sort of pinch the pixels all together. It sort of melds it together in an organic way that hides the fact that it's generated from a bunch of clunky spheres. And you could take that, mix it on top of the other one, so you have kind of two working together. And you could sort of take both their opacities, play around with different amounts of mixing the two, and that gives you just even more to play with. Now we just have some nice light little steam. So let's go ahead and go back to the main work finally. We're at the point where now we need to track it in to the plate. I need to find where the coffee cup is in 3D. So we'll go back to where we've got all our 3D track stuff. There's one there. That must be the coffee cup. Or not. That actually could be the thing behind the coffee cup. I think I might just use this to start. As far as distance from camera goes, that should be about the same spot the coffee cup is. So I'm going to go ahead and copy them, go into our steamy coffee work, paste the camera and the null. I really should make sure they're pre-comped alone before I then work on putting it in 3D. Now I can copy the position, paste it on my steam. I'll rotate it so it's facing camera. I'll use the anchor point to shift it up. I'm going to temporarily throw levels and pinch the exposure way up so I can see where it is. I can do small adjustments using these. I'm actually going to err on the side of too low because I can very easily just mask out the lip of the mug. So we've got our steam, it's in there. And then I'm just going to want to double check that. I mean, I've got this in the right spot in 3D space. I just want to confirm that that is true. Uh-oh, well, he definitely grabs it and moves with it. So we're going to have to figure out the solution for that. Let me at least make sure it's sticking up to the point where he grabs it. And it looks like it is. And he starts to shift it right around here. I'm going to have to bring his hand back in front of it. Let's go ahead and just go back up to the main work and just see again how this is comping. Whoops. Little bit bright. I can just pull this back down here easily too. This is another thing where it's hard to tell until you watch it moving full speed, that you might be like, oh, that's way too distracting. But we're going to assume that it's going to be pretty distracting once it's moving. You barely want to see it on a still frame, and you know that it's going to be more visible as soon as it's moving. All right, so the last thing we're going to have to do here is make sure that the steam is following the coffee cup as he moves it up to his mouth. One way we can do that is by keyframing the position of the emitter itself so that it will follow along where the coffee mug is. And we can also control the birth rate of the particles so that as it's moving up, not as many particles will be generated. And then once it comes to its resting spot, they'll start being generated again. And this should give us a pretty believable motion. Now I'm just tweaking the parameters just a little bit, getting the keyframes in the right spot to make it look just right. Let's take a look at the steam now in the main comp. Now that we're seeing it in motion, it is way too intense still. It's probably twice as visible as it needs to be, but the idea is there and it's working. And as he lifts it, it kind of dies down a bit. And then as it comes to a rest, it starts steaming again. All that's going to work really well. We're going to need to add a little bit more roto just to make sure his hand actually occludes the steam. And there we have it. All right, let's just go over some final finishing touches we can add to really polish it off. We'll kind of take a look at how everything's comping. We'll make sure the blurs are all good, small color correction adjustments we want to do. We also just need to figure out the grain, make sure that all the grain is coming back, the original plate grain where we can, and then in some areas we'll need to bring back our custom grain pass and bring that back on top. First thing I want to show you is this cool trick I've got to adding a flare. It's not quite the same as adding lens elements using optical flares or something where it's a very visible lens flare. This one gives us less of a flare and more of a chromatic lensing effect. And when it's carefully mixed in, it has a great organic feel. We're going to take the exterior work because I want the background already in. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that. We're going to bring it up on top, kind of where we've got our Atmos, kind of on top of all the work. And the very first thing I'm going to do is invert this, -100 on the X and the Y. We're going to need a levels on it. We're going to need a VR chromatic aberrations effect. We're going to use this one. There's other options out there and there's other plugins that you can install, but this one comes with After Effects and I've used it for a lot of things, honestly. It doesn't have to be just for VR. And if I take the trick to using it is if you take the horizontal field of view and vertical, bring them all the way down to 60, then you get something that you expect to see with a normal chromatic aberration effect. Obviously the default values are way too much. But if I was to say to put this at -1 and 1, you can see something a bit more subtle. What we want to do actually for this scenario, I'm actually going to not do subtle. I'll do like a -20 and a +20. Want something really exaggerated. I might even play around with where the point of interest is, because I actually want to sort of separate these channels so that they kind of go horizontally next to each other, something kind of like that. And you want to go pretty large with it. This is probably a bit too large. But the goal is to separate the channels large enough that if I was to put a fast blur on it and crank up the value by a lot, you start to get this nice kind of rainbowy feel to it. Yeah, something kind of like that. If I was to take this, put this on add blending mode, for instance, and put it on top, obviously this in itself is adding a huge atmospheric quality, way too much. What I want to do with this one is just kiss it in just barely. So I'm going to take a levels before it does the other effects, really bring it down, because my goal is for this to be interacting with the brightest parts of the image. So it's kind of being caused by the lights that are in the scene. And if I turn off the blur and the chromatic, you'll see that it's just those lights that are really picking it up and the rest of the things kind of just fall away. And that's kind of what we want with this. And we want to selectively grab just the brightest parts. And if I control the values on the chromatic, I can control how rainbowy this feels. But that looks nice, something kind of like that. You can dial this way back. At the end of the day, it should be something pretty subtle, maybe just 30 or something. I'm gonna go ahead and rename it while I'm here. We'll call this Custom Flare Soft. We're actually gonna do another one of these. We'll call it Custom Flare Hard. And then this one is going to have a lot less blur on it. And this one will also have a lot less of the chromatic. This is going to bring a little bit more detail into this effect. I can tell immediately that the way that these lights are showing up down here, it's way too intense. But I do like some of the other effects that are happening in other parts of the plate. I love what's happening kind of over the plant down here, getting this nice kind of effect coming from probably from the exterior out there. I might actually do a little bit of masking here. I also want to just mask out kind of the middle region too a bit. They're going to be very soft masks. And I just want to pull it off of areas that we don't want anything to be distracting. I'm going to go ahead and take a snapshot with those turned off. And here we can see what these are doing. And this will really shine when you see it in motion. It's also worth taking note what it looks like with the matte bars on. You can see kind of that bright bottom one kind of goes away once we turn this on anyway, so it's not a huge issue. It's also worth having a screenshot of the original plate. It's worth having that on hand as well, just so you can always compare against where it started. Now would be a great time to talk about how could we generate grain that matches the original plate that we can use to regrain paintwork or these solid graphics that we have here that are currently grainless. So the very first thing you would do to do this, let's actually do it in its own little pre-comp here. I'm gonna take the plate and we're just gonna put it into a comp all by itself, and we're gonna name this grain maker. So this will be our grain maker. I'm gonna put that back to untone map. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna make a solid. Control Y to make a solid. I'm gonna change its color to exactly a 50% gray, 0050 or 0.5.5.5 RGB. On this solid, I'm going to put a match grain. Now this comes with After Effects. I'm just gonna set it to final output. As soon as you do that, final output, and nothing will happen until you select noise source layer. And we're gonna select the plate as our source layer. Again, hard to see at this point still. If we wanted, we could throw an adjustment layer on here as a guide layer. When you put a levels on here, you can see all the values. Well, it's a 50% gray solid, so that's why it's got a peak right in the very, very middle. You can up the contrast of this by essentially pinching these in really tight. I want to make sure I'm going the same amount with both ends. So I'm actually going to bring this one to a 0.45, and then this one will need to go to a 0.55. And I know that those are going to be equal. It's centered directly around that middle. And now you can definitely see it. I can switch between the channels now, and you can see we have a lot of grain. You could use this, you could render this out, not including the adjustment layer, of course, and use it with the linear light blending mode to put it right back on the footage. But we're not going to stop there. There's something I don't like about this one. And if I look at the channels independently, blue channel looks pretty good. If I look at red channel, it's kind of hard, probably very hard to see, but there's like a little bit of horizontal striation happening. There's moments where you get kind of these straight lines, which never happens in real grain. You can see it a little bit in the green channel as well. And some of that stems from the fact that when you select the layer and you do this, you're leaving it up to After Effects to pick random spots on the footage to use to generate that grain. Maybe it's not picking the best spots. If you go into your sampling section, you can see that it's sampling from the very first frame, frame 0. It ignores your frame numbering in your comp. It's pulling 8 samples from it with a sample size of 24 pixels. And right now the sample selection is set to automatic. We're actually gonna wanna switch that to manual. Yeah, so we're gonna pick spots now. There's a drop down here. When you're in manual, you can actually change the value of all the sample points. You can also change the locations for all the intensities. But I'm going to link all of these together because I want the intensity of these points be in the same location as where my sample points themselves are. So I'm gonna go ahead and immediately do this. I'm gonna pick whip them. This one to this one, number 2, 1 to number 3. I'm alt clicking on these to get the expression thing to come up immediately. And there we go. So those are now linked. I won't have to adjust those. And now I'm just going to pick these sample points. For the first one, I'm just going to select over here. I'm specifically looking for areas where around that sample point is just a nice consistent grain pattern. There's no high detail contrasty areas. We're not looking at some strange pattern on the chair. Basically, it's a nice neutral spot. You can see the sample size too. It shows you the box of how large it's taking. So you want to make sure that whole area is just a nice clean grain pattern. I wouldn't mind if it was a bigger sample box too. So I'm going to grab that. For number 2, I'm going to do a similar thing. Number 3, and I'm actually going to go around and find different luminance areas. I want to get a nice mix. So I'm not just sampling from one specific area. Let's even grab one in the darkest area down here too. All right, so we've got our new points, and the points that we picked, I am confident to say they're better than whatever the automatic ones would be. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and switch back to final output. I'm going to turn on that adjustment just so I can see what I'm looking at here. And it is egregious. It is horrible. So why did this happen? Let's go back and see what's going on here. I'm going to try putting this back to 24 sample size and see what happens. As soon as I did that, it is great. It's way better. Red, green, blue. It's great. That was like the first time I've changed the sample size, and now I am wondering what is up with sample size. Say I go to 48. Yeah, look at that. The higher I go with sample size, the worse it gets. 100 samples. Yeah, amazing. The larger your sample size, directly proportional to the worse your grain is. Cool. Let's keep that at default. This is perfect. All right, I'm gonna turn off my adjustment layer. So now we'll just be looking at what looks like a gray solid, and we're gonna render this out. Let's take a look. So I'm gonna go to where I rendered it. Elements. It made the folder called grain. Excellent. There it is with the version number of the project it came from, _grain. Again, After Effects is like, oh, is this ACES 2065? No, it is not. We want to preserve RGB, or again, maybe it's safer if I do this, which is the exact same as preserving RGB in this case. Hit OK. So we've got our grain. Let's test it out. So I'm going to drag and drop these into our main work here. At first, it's going to cover everything. Need to make sure it goes to linear light. The first thing we should do is take a screenshot of what the original plate looks like. And that's why I have the plate sitting down here below the denoise in the main work. I have it there as a reference so that I can quickly compare between the denoised version and the original plate. I'm going to take a screenshot and then go back to our denoise and then put on our grain that we just rendered out and brought back in. You will immediately see that our grain is certainly way more intense. Take ours and we'll start dialing back its opacity. Yeah, I'll try 50%. I'm toggling plate grain versus ours. That's actually looking pretty similar. Obviously it's dancing. It's in a new location. That's because it's not going to match perfectly because we aren't pulling the exact grain. Grain's always, every frame it's different. So, but it did a great job of matching that grain. And we can even check each channel. I can still use that same screenshot comparing the two. And honestly, it's looking pretty great in all 3 channels. So that's great. That's super promising. Before we start adding back the custom grain pass we just made, I want to show you a technique we can use to preserve the original plate grain. We'll go over this step with a simplified project. If I take a look at the plate here, I'm going to toggle just that and the light here. I'm going to take a screenshot of this, turn the exposure up. And now if we look at it, I unsoloed those. What we're looking at now is the plate that's been denoised. And if I compare against the screenshot I took, we don't have noise, right? We're looking at the denoise. So how do we bring back that exact same noise right back on top? It's super easy. Let's take both those pre-comps. Again, this is a great reason why these are kind of separated out. We can take the denoise and the original plate, grab them both and bring them into a new comp. We don't want them to sequence. We actually just want them to be on top of each other. So we've got our new comp, pre-comp here. We've got our plate denoise. It's important that it's the one that's on top if you want to get it right back accurately. We're going to take that top one. We're going to change its blending mode to being subtract. It'll go black immediately. If you crank the exposure really far in the viewer, you will eventually start to see some of that grain. It's all in there. So let's go ahead and bring in this pre-comp. And we can call this AccuGrain is what I just like to call it, but we can call this original grain bring back. The blending mode that you want to put it back on is going to be add, subtract, then add. And as soon as we've done that, you can immediately see the difference here as we bring back the grain. It looks good in a lot of places, but if you look closely, there is some weird stuff you're going to see. In the areas that had high contrast, there's a little bit of artifacting kind of visible almost through it. Same here, if we look at where the plant is, you're catching a little bit of the original plate coming in with that grain pass. So those areas, we aren't going to be able to use this grain technique. So for that, what we're going to want to do is first we want to make sure that it does not apply the grain to those areas. So an easy way we could do that, we can use the set matte effect, and we can select the parts that we don't want the grain to go on. So for instance, the book that I'm looking at here is the CG books layer. Now it's only doing it to that. I need to invert the channel. By default, it's using alpha channel. And the way that we've set up this comp, these layers are already set up. Everybody has alpha. They're kind of all ready to go. We should be able to just source them using set matte and use the alpha from each to dictate where they are. So I inverted that channel. Now we're not applying it to the books. Perfect. We don't want to apply it to the screen. So I'm just going to do duplicate set matte, and instead let's grab the monitors, and that remove the grain from the monitors. Great. Let's go ahead and also do it for the CG plant. So we'll have another one, CG plant, astronauts. Let's go ahead and do them too. Okay, now they don't have grain. Great. For now, that's it. Let's just do those ones. Okay, so now we want to add grain back to just those things. So we're going to go ahead and bring back in, if you haven't already imported in the grain pass that we generated before, we'll go ahead and import that. I think I might have already had it here. There we go. Always make sure it's being interpreted correctly. Came out of this project as Aces CG. Delete this other one. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and bring this back on, up next to the other grain. Let me solo it so you can see it better. If we mouse over it and you look in the upper right in the info panel, you'll see that as we hover along it, you can see almost all the values, they're all hovering right around 0.5 because we used a 50% gray to generate this. And because we did it that way, we're going to be using the linear light blending mode. The best way I can describe linear light blending mode without knowing anything about how it functions under the hood is that 50% gray or a 0.5 value in linear light will not impact anything, but any values above or below will both brighten and darken respectively. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the other grain just for a second so you can kind of see what it's doing here. But if I turn that on and off, you can see the grain being applied. So what we're going to do now is we only want to apply it to the certain areas. And this is actually going to be really simple. All we have to do for this one is put a set matte effect on it. And we're going to source the other grain, the original grain bring back. And we want to use effects and masks. This way, it's actually going to utilize all those set mattes that we had already established for the other one. It's going to utilize those and do the opposite. I have to again hit invert matte. There we go. If I turn on and off this layer that I just added, it is now going to be adding grain to all the pieces that we told not to have grain on the other layer. Now you can see that it's way too intense. We can just start pulling down the opacity until we hit the right level so that you don't see any sort of seams between both. I think we nailed it right here around 33%. And now there's no more weird artifacting. You can see, especially here, looking at the screen, no strange artifacts on our screen. It's a nice continuous grain now across everything, all the work we've been doing. What's great about this workflow is that we're only putting the custom grain on the pieces we need to. I'm gonna go ahead and compare the screenshot of the original plate. Actually, you know what I'm gonna compare? In the very bottom of my comp, I still have the original plate, the one that has grain on it. I wanna get a screenshot of that actually. Screenshot of that, I'm comparing that against where we've landed at the very end. And if I zoom in closely, then you can see that the grain structure is identical. Nothing's changing in any of those places. The only place where it's changing is the place where we've actually added objects anyway. Before we sign off, let's go through a quick example of how we can set up our render queue. Easily accessible from the main folder in the project panel, I've got a render EXR and a render Qt pre-comp. When dealing with heavy renders, it's always a good habit to render individual frames before rendering video files. In the render EXR comp, all we have is our main work with nothing else going on. Right now, we're viewing our linear ACES CG image. Let's go ahead and add it to the render queue with Control M. When rendering anything to send to the client, first and foremost, be sure to follow any technical specs that the post-production team defines. We'll use best render settings, making sure that the color depth is set to 32-bit. In the output module settings, we'll use PIZ compression for our EXRs. And in the color tab, we'll make sure that our output color space will convert the shot back to whatever color space the original plate came in our case, ACES 2065. This conversion applies only because we have our project set up to work in ACES CG color. I love to automate the naming and location of the render. For this to work well, it's important that you increment up your save files often and also name the project following the correct format defined by the technical specs for the show. Here's what I like to use based on my folder structure organization. Starting with the location of the project file, it will go up one directory, then up another directory, then create a folder called renders, then a folder called sequence, then a folder with the name of the project, and finally, the EXRs themselves will live in there with the same formatted name. Note that when you click on the path, it will open up to where your project file lives, not where the frames will actually be saved. But you can see where the automatic magic is happening with the way it shows the path here. Once the EXRs are rendered, we can import them back in to render out of QuickTime much faster. Note that we'll have to interpret the settings to make sure that it converts it from the ACES 2065 that it's in now back to our project's ACES CG. In the Qt pre-comp, I've changed the resolution to 1920 by 1080, and I've copied over the show color layer from the main work, making sure that it's not a guide layer. Now we can render a QuickTime with the show color baked into it for production to review. Again, be sure to follow any technical specs that the post-production team defines with resolution and format. A common file format will be Avid DNx HD SQ 8-bit. Audio output off, and in the color tab, we will make sure to fill the checkbox Preserve RGB. We do not want After Effects to apply any additional color conversions to this. We've already defined our color using our adjustment layer in the comp. The QuickTime will follow a similar naming scheme, but instead go into a QuickTime folder. If you're using a render farm or using a background render, with this method, you'll never need to touch the render queue once it's set up for a shot. All you have to do is make sure to increment up your saves. And that's how we set up our render. Thank you for taking the time to check out this tutorial. I hope there was something useful in there you were able to take away and incorporate into your workflow. Until next time, cheers.